Welcome to Ministries That Podcast, where I talk to successful ministry leaders about how they're using podcasting to amplify their mission and grow their ministry so you can too. I'm Tim Hall, your host and owner of Sonomorphic, a podcast production company that specializes in podcasting for ministries. My guest today is Jeff Pitts. He's a pastor and host of the Collective's Conversations. Jeff and I are going to talk about how he got started in podcasting back in 2019, starting his own podcast after several years of co-hosting another podcast, and then the value of having a podcast alongside vocational ministry. So let's get to it. Here's my conversation with Jeff Pitts. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Oh, Tim, thanks for the invite. It really means a lot. I know you're a podcaster, so it's always fun when somebody asks you to be the guest because I'm not really sure how to do this. I'm really much better at the host part, I think. So
you've been a host for now 5-6 years. How long have you been in podcasting?
So as a consumer, I've been in podcasting since early days. Like I remember a friend of mine sent me some Andy Stanley podcast, and I said, "What is this? Is it going to cost me things?" Like, no, you have to download it through Apple or whatever. And like, I don't even think I had a smartphone at the time. But as a host, been podcasting now since probably fall of 2019. So it's now 5 years. Second show now. But yeah, it's fun. I love it.
Yeah, so I first came to learn about you and your current podcast that you're working on from my wife. She's an avid listener of Annie F. Downs' podcast. That sounds fun. And she put this post on Instagram for people because people were giving her some podcast recommendations. And she was like, leave a comment below if you have a podcast and which episode I should listen to, and I'll DM you my thoughts once I've listened to it. And so my wife threw our show in there. Then she was going back through that Spotify playlist that they've then curated from those. I was just checking that it has over 350 episodes that people have put in that list, which is nuts. And your episode with Ainsley B., Boo Boos and Enneagram 2s is towards the top of that list. She's also an Enneagram 2. When she saw that, she added it to her playlist to listen through. And so after listening to a few episodes of your podcast, she was like, "Hey, Tim, you should have him on your podcast." And so here we are. My episode with Dave Ramsey is on that list, but I'm way down the list. I'm at like 164. But your episode is number 18 on the list, I noticed when I scrolled back through.
I've not even seen that list. I'm like, I don't know. So, if you just want to share the list, that's great. Like, you sent the questions, and I told my wife that. I was like, I didn't even know there was a list. Like,
yeah, so she took all of those comments, her team, and just compiled this massive playlist with all of these episodes in it so that Annie could listen through them, and then anybody else that wanted to listen through or see who else has a podcast that's a listener of That Sounds Fun could go back through it. But you're number 18 on the list. So I was like, I should ask you just for fun, how are you so quick in responding to that you got so high on the list?
I follow Annie, your wife. I listen to Annie. I've listened to Annie off and on for a long time. Love her show. Love what she's doing. As a podcaster, I feel like there's a lot of takeaways you can learn. She's one of the best at asking questions and engaging with a guest and feeling like you almost feel like you're in the conversation with her. So I've been an Annie F. Downs fan for a long time. So I saw it and I was real hesitant because I'm really bad at the promotion piece of podcasting. I feel like there's a lot of self-promotion that happens and I don't love it always. But I was like, I'll throw it in. Annie may listen, she may not, right? But maybe somebody else will listen. So I saw the post, I commented, and in truth, I leveraged the information I knew. So Ainsley's a friend of mine, Ainsley B., who's the guest, and Ainsley's been a guest on the Collective's Conversations and on the Leadership Drip.
Yeah.
But I knew Ainsley was also friends with Annie, so I knew if I dropped Ainsley's name, I had a higher likelihood of Annie listening. So it was really strategic on my part and kind of almost manipulative. I don't know, but it's a great episode. And I think a lot of the episode, of Ainsley, but because I knew Annie and Ainsley were friends, I thought, well, I'll drop Ainsley's name in that conversation and maybe Annie will listen. Yeah, it got a little bit of traction. Annie did listen to the episode and did DM me, I woke up one morning to Annie F. Downs in my DMs, and I was like, and as a podcaster, it's like, in a Christian podcaster, there's probably 4 people, if they DM'd you, you would lose your mind. And it's Annie F. Downs, it's Carrie Newhoff, it's Tim Ross right now. Those 3 people reach out to you and you're like, the world is over. This is the greatest thing ever. So yeah, she DM'd me and it was great. And I was just thankful she listened to the conversation. So
nice. Did she give you just her thoughts? I'm just curious. What did she say?
So yeah, she did give thoughts on the episode, that she appreciated it. And I think the thing that, like, again, we're all very self-centered. As much as we want to be Christ-like, we feed off things like that. She said I was a very good interviewer and asked great questions. So that was something I took away from it and felt good about, felt proud about in a good way. So yeah, so it was just great, and had some exchange with her on direct messages. She's super kind, and it was great, and just a really fun interaction. But yeah, I didn't expect her to respond. So
yeah, that's so cool. That's so cool. So I was looking back, after I found out about you, I was looking back and seeing what you had done before, and you had started podcasting back in 2019, as you had mentioned, with your friend Rob Foltz, and that podcast was called The Leadership Drip. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about that show first, and then we'll talk about the current show that you're working on. But tell me about the conversations that you guys had that led you to want to start getting into podcasting back in the fall of 19.
Yeah, we got into it almost by accident. Rob at the time was the campus pastor at the university. I was doing young adult ministry, and we were having all these conversations about young adults in the local church. And we were just having conversations. We were trying to figure it out. And so he calls me one day. And Rob is if you understand Enneagram, he's Enneagram 7. So he's like all over adventure, new ideas, new things all the time. He calls me one day and he goes, let's write a book. And I was like, cool, let's write a book. That sounds like fun, something I want to do. And so we sit down, outline a book. And I was like, Rob, we don't know. We have all the questions and none of the answers. And so we had all this book outlined, and we're like, we don't have any content because we need to talk to people. And I said, what if we just start talking to people to get content for the book? And I said, we need to record it so we can go back and listen to it. And then one thing led to another. And we're like, we should probably just release these as podcast episodes. And so the long story is we started having conversations, primarily talk to people about maybe a book we were writing, turned it into a podcast, and never wrote the book. Like the book is still just an outline form. But we had probably 100, I think there's 102, maybe 103 episodes, which for a podcast is a lot. A lot of people never get past like 8 or 10.
Yeah.
And we were just like blessed. Like, I don't know how else to say it, because early on we were just striving to like get anybody on the show. He was a campus pastor at Lee. I was connected to Lee University. I thought, if worst case is we have professors, like we'll just talk to professors, I guess. I don't know. And the Lord just kept opening doors for us to talk to people of all sorts of leadership, all sorts of walks of life, influencers, authors. And we just felt so blessed that we could have these conversations. So we did it for 4 years until some life changes. But it was a lot of fun.
Yeah. So I'd love to talk about that show a little bit, and then talk about that life change that then led you to step out on your own and do the Collectives Conversations podcast. So the Leadership Drip, the description that went with that was coffee and conversations with leaders leading the next generation. And so I'd love to hear from you, as you've been in podcasting now for a while. How have you seen it be an effective way to connect with other ministry leaders?
It's a great tool. One, because guys like you, me, Tim, like if I'm being honest, don't always get in the rooms where everybody's at. But it's amazing when you say, hey, we use Zoom with me, or we're using Riverside or whatever the platform is for 45 minutes or an hour, and we'll record it and we'll talk about your book and we'll send it out to an audience. They'll be like, yeah, sign me up. I'm there. So what it really became, almost in a selfish way, is the ability to have conversations we normally wouldn't have conversations with people with. Like, you just don't get in those rooms that easily. But podcasting became sort of a resource where it could put you in some rooms and in some conversations you normally wouldn't have. I think that for us became sort of not maybe that's driving force, but the bonus of it. Like, we loved having conversations, but now we're getting to have conversations with people like the Beviers, with Chad Veach, and people who like we probably just wouldn't get in a room with. But God kept opening those doors. We kept having the conversations, and just believe that our responsibility on our side was to steward the conversation well, to curate it well, so that people who listen get something out of it and some benefit. So,
yeah. So what were you just listed a couple, what were some of your favorite guests that you had on that podcast because you had the opportunity to chat with people because you had a podcast?
Yeah. Beth Moore was great. If you get a chance to talk to Beth Moore, we call her Aunt Beth now, because like you walk away from that conversation feeling like family. Chad Veach was great conversation. We talked to John and Lisa Bevere, and just some crazy opportunities. And those conversations. But then you also had some conversations with people that a lot of people don't know. Those are the big platform people. And then you just get to have conversations with people who maybe they have a smaller platform or they just have their first book, and you get to know them and they become friends. And I think that's sort of been the joy, Tim, of this as well, is like now I'm friends with some of those people. Like they're in my phone and we text or we have conversations or we're encouraging one another. And I think podcasting for me, while it has opened doors of conversations with people I wouldn't talk to, it's also created friendships that I probably wouldn't have. And I think that's been sort of an additional benefit.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I mean, it gives you an excuse to have conversations with people. And then, from there can become friends, can, be people that you meet up with at conferences down the road. And so, it's a great opportunity. So
I think that's the fun thing, Tim. Like some of these people, like I've only seen them through a screen. And then you see them in real life and you're like, oh my gosh. And you feel like you know them because you've had these kind of conversations and intimate conversations. And like the first time you meet, like in person, you're like, but we're still friends. Like it's this really weird, you like hug and you're like, oh my gosh, it's so good to see you. And I've never really seen you in person before, but we've talked like 5 times. And like, it's an odd thing, but it's great all at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really cool. It's really cool. So I've read about you, Jeff, and that you've worn basically all of the hats in local church ministry, and that most recently you were the lead pastor at the Collectives Church. I would love to hear from that perspective as well. What have you seen to be the benefit of having a podcast alongside your vocational ministry?
I don't know. I like doing it. I like talking to people. So that was the benefit for me. I think also I'm a big fan of local church, but I think it gives opportunity for a wider reach, gives opportunity to get your message and the message of the gospel out further, and gives opportunity to encourage other people. With the leadership drip, we were trying to encourage young leaders and leaders of local churches to engage young leaders. So we're trying to be an important part of that conversation. And I think it just allows, in a local church setting, is we sing some songs, somebody speaks and preaches, and we all say amen and go home, or we have a response time, however your church looks. Podcasting allows some space for conversation and maybe to tackle tough topics that maybe we can't do or handle as neatly in a church setting. What's funny is like I took this idea of podcasting and we put it into the local church in a way. So in our local church, we did these things. And again, all ideas are up for grabs. Steal them, take them if you're listening and want it. That's great. I don't mind. But we did this thing called Couch Conversations. We're basically in a church setting. I would take someone as a guest who has a story to tell and do like basically a podcast style conversation in the church setting. And it was like really just an adaptation of podcasting to a sermon setting. And it wasn't necessarily a sermon, but it allowed for a conversation that maybe you can't have as easily from a straightforward kind of sermon. So really podcasting impacted our church as much as the church impacted podcasting. So I think there's always things to learn and grow from, but I think from just a local church standpoint, like even if you're just getting your messages out on a podcast platform, it allows your church to go back and listen to them. It allows them, if somebody missed a Sunday, to listen to the content, especially if you're a series teacher. I think it's super simple to record your messages and put them in a podcast platform. And every church should do it. Even small churches, like find some teenager who has a MacBook and can record into it and drop it in Anchor or some of these free podcast platforms. There's not much to it, but it's important, I think.
Yeah. It's great to be able to have a place for people to go to and refer back to content, or just be a resource that you can continually be like, we had that episode and we talked about that specific topic. That'd be beneficial for you to go back and listen to, just as a resource for a pastor. You had mentioned that there was some life change that happened and led to the ending of the leadership drip and the beginning of the Collectives conversation. So I'd love to hear what that was like, after 4 years of co-hosting that with Rob. What led you guys to decide that it was time to end the leadership drip?
Tim, have you ever watched the sitcom Friends?
I'm one of those people that haven't really watched Friends. I feel like I've seen a few episodes here or there.
So there's an episode in Friends, and some of our listeners may resonate with this, where Ross and Rachel take a break, right? They're on a break. They don't know if they're broke up or if they're separated or they're just taking whatever. It's very confusing. They don't really know what a break means. So Rob and I took a break. This lasted now 2 years. I actually was with him this past weekend at a young adult event and helped him serve there. And so we're still friends. There was nothing like that. It's just life seasons got busy. I was in the midst of pastoring and planting the church.
Yeah.
And our church went into a season of a merger, was very busy. He was still campus pastor at the university, and they got kind of busier there. And then in the midst of that was the prayer vigil that lasted 2 weeks and was just, he was giving 16, 18 hours a day. So it was the right thing at the right time. And then we kept going. We'll come back to these conversations, but just the problem has been getting schedules lined up when you have a co-host and things like that.
Sure.
It's getting you guys on the same schedule, your guests on the same schedule. So we've talked about coming back and doing some isolated like episodes, like some conversations. And I think we will, just because they're conversations we still want to have, but it's a matter of getting it lined up on schedules, which becomes a challenge when you have two people hosting. So
yeah, but at some point in that conversation, you decided then to step out and start your own podcast. I'd love to hear a little bit of that, going from 4 years of co-hosting this podcast to now starting fresh with your own podcast.
I love this, right? I mean, I think that's part of it. Like when I wasn't doing it, I missed it. I think that was one of the things I realized because it was about a year's time or more where we hadn't recorded. And I was like, I love doing this. I feel like it's a gift God's given me. And I feel like irresponsible by not stewarding the gift. And so I talked to Rob and I said, hey, listen, I want to start a new podcast that's kind of a little bit different than what we were doing, called The Collective's Conversations, help people kind of tell the story of where life and faith intersect. And he's like, go for it. And so I think the difficult part was, I don't mind starting something new. I like starting new things, but you're almost creating sort of a new audience. You want to bring that audience you had over, and some of them did track with that, but some of them weren't on board because it was a little bit different than what we were doing. And then you're also asking for more time of people. Be like, hey, I know you've got 12 podcasts you already listen to, but here's one more, right? So that was the difficult part on the audience building. It's still the difficult part of the audience building. And then the other part is going to find new conversations. Some of the guests in the Collective's Conversations are conversations with people I've had previously. They're new, they're fresh conversations from a different perspective. But then you got to go find new guests that kind of fit that niche. In some ways, it's a little easier than having your first podcast because you've got some credibility where you can go, hey, this is what I've done previously. Would you want to be on the show? So like credibility goes with you, which makes it a little bit easier. But you're still out here going like, hey, do you want to come talk to me? Like you don't know me and I just slid in your DMs. Do you want to talk to me? Or I just sent you an email and here's my podcast. If you want to come on it, I would love it. So yeah, that's part of the challenge. And with it comes some yeses and a lot of no's typically.
Yeah, I feel you there. Same thing with having a podcast that's interview driven. It does take a lot more work to get people on the show. And that's actually why I did bi-weekly for my podcast, because I'm, full-time doing podcast production as a business and then doing this as part of it. But I was like, I can't sustain a weekly podcast to book everybody that I need to book and do all the prep and still run the business. And so, yeah, there's definitely an element of that as much as you can, try and get ahead on booking because it'll catch up to you if you don't. I'm sure you felt that at times as well.
Yeah, there's weeks that like my Calendly will have 3 or 4 episodes. And I got to prepare, record, and you have just this massive amount of recordings in 1 week, and then you go 2 weeks with no recordings. And so, I mean, it's part of the challenge of this, but it's kind of I don't know, I'm addicted to it. I don't know about you, but I don't know if I would ever not do it. So
yeah, it's definitely been fun in the, I guess, 6-8 months. I'm not even sure now. Not a year yet, but several months in with this show. It's been a lot of fun. So with starting your own podcast, what were some of the goals or what were some of your hopes with the new podcast and either guests that you had on or topics you wanted to talk about or what did that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I probably wasn't as strategic as I needed to be. The goal was really just to keep having conversations. It's really my heart, hearing people's stories, helping curate conversations that the listener on the backside will have benefit. You mentioned your wife being Enneagram 2, which is what I am as well. Which, if you know the Enneagram, that means I'm the helper, and my whole sort of life motivation is to help other people. So that's the goal, really. To have a conversation where somebody walks away from it and goes gosh, that really helped me. It helped me in my faith. It helped me maybe as a parent, maybe in relationships, maybe whatever the context is. that something about that was a benefit to them, especially in their walk with Jesus. Like, sure, I want them to live better and have a better life, but I want them also to grow in their faith. And so that was really sort of the thought, like, let's have these conversations where life and faith intersect. So hopefully at the end of the day or the end of the conversation, somebody gains something from it and has a better walk with Jesus or has some handlebars to steer their faith in a better direction. And that's really kind of been the goal. Like, I have some numeric goals, like, and I'm way short of those. So if somebody wants to like listen to a bunch of shows and help me, that'd be great. But at the end of the day, like, the metrics are meaningless without somebody having a benefit from it.
Yeah. Yeah. Without it actually impacting lives, what's the point of the numbers? Yeah, for sure. So now that you've been publishing the Collective's conversations for a few months now, you started at the beginning of the year, what have been some benefits that you've seen to having your own podcast as well as your role at the church? How has that all played together, and what's been the benefit? As it's what I frequently tell people, podcasting is great for helping people amplify their mission and grow their ministry. Have you seen that to be true?
Yeah, I think so. Again, I think it puts you in some spaces that you're not normally at, like your wife finding my show. Like, otherwise, probably we would have never connected. I think that's the unique piece. It's probably not like, I think a lot of people get into podcasting or think they should start a podcast and it's going to make them instantaneously famous. And there's only like a handful of people that happens with. And like, again, like I mentioned, Tim Ross, he's like the outlier in the whole conversation, that he went from like 0 to millions in like minutes. Most of us grind away at this thing called podcasting to get a little bit of exposure. But I think what it does is it allows us to continue the conversations and have the mission and message be amplified, like you said, to audiences that may never show up to our ministry or to our building. Now, I think digital content like we're putting out, podcasting, social media is great. I'm also a fan, like, get into the local church, because only certain things can happen in the context of a local church around people. Like, you can't feel the community on a podcast. I hope you feel like you know me and you know Tim when you listen to this, but you don't really know us. Like, go to your local church. Like, so I'm a both and kind of guy. Like, I think, like, I love digital content. I love recording content. I hope it opens new doors for me to take the message, to get opportunities to speak or preach, or I want to write a book, those type of things. If that happens, great. But gosh, I really just hope it helps people. Like, again, back to that same conversation. I just hope it benefits somebody.
Yeah, that's the thing with podcasting that I hope to see grow in the coming years is the digital community that then becomes a local community. And sometimes people do that by doing like live recordings. And so you get a bunch of people that listen to this show together in a room, and then they automatically have a thing in common. But I'd love to see what that looks like, specifically with Christian podcasting. It would be great for it to basically spawn groups of some nature that people are having conversations similar to what's going on their favorite podcast, but with other people in real life around a table.
I think you mentioned Annie F. Downs. I think she's done something that is of great benefit. I think it's called the Singles League, maybe. Annie's been open about her singleness her whole time podcasting, but she created this like group or club, essentially, you could join for other Christian singles who are struggling with this and walking through this life stage or whatever it is, and kind of creating a community within her community, which I think is valuable if you can do that. Like, and I think there's some meetups and some things like that where people are like, hey, we have these things in common, let's meet up. Again, when you have a platform her size, you can leverage a little bit more to do some of those things. But I think even in smaller platforms, you can go, hey, we're going to have a conversation about this, whether it's in a Facebook group, I know there's a lot of that, or other places. Let's continue that conversation somewhere. And I think people do find connection there, and hopefully in real life begin to make connections.
Yeah. I hope to see more of that happening, for sure.
That'd be great.
So I'd love to get into some of the technical side of things and the content side of things about the podcast. I saw that we both host on Captivate, and Captivate launched back in, I think it was early 2019, which is the same year that you launched the Leadership Drip. So have you been on Captivate the whole time?
No, I just got on Captivate with the Collective's conversation.
Gotcha.
We were on Fireside, which was not a bad platform, but I wanted to keep the Leadership Drip active and
Yeah.
hosting and wanted to start a new one and maybe want to start a third one. I don't know. Like those are things down the road.
Okay.
The beauty of Captivate
Yeah.
was for one price, I could host multiple podcasts.
Yeah.
Fireside was like one set price for one and an additional $8 or $10 and additional with the Leadership Drip not being active, like I thought it was a better stewardship to use Captivate. I think I'm in some Facebook podcast group. I don't know. And I asked in there.
Yeah.
And I think one of the owners actually commented. He's like, hey, mate, like I think they're from London, right? Like,
yeah.
And he's like, hey, you should look at Captivate before you make a decision. He's one of the owners of actually the company. And I was like, wow, if you're in here trying to solicit, it's worth my look. So far, so good. I like a lot of the features of it. I think there's some things about it that if I wasn't using other things would use, like they have a booking feature, but I really like Calendly better than what they were doing, just the free version of Calendly. But so far, so good on Captivate. They've been a good host. Would like some of the maybe the metrics to be a little bit different, like a little more detailed, a little bit more intuitive maybe. But again, I'm not living and dying by metrics, but everything else is pretty simple and pretty straightforward. Really clean platform, which Fireside was a little bit cumbersome at times. So it's been a good shift.
Nice. Yeah. Same thing for me. I had come from, when I worked at Ramsey Solutions, we were on Libsyn for a while and then moved to Megaphone. And then I was trying to figure out, okay, what's something similar to Megaphone without the cost of Megaphone? Because Megaphone is rather expensive, meant for larger shows that are selling a bunch of ads, and it makes sense to do that with how they can traffic ads. But Captivate has a bunch of great features. It's super simple to use, and like you said, it's super easy to then add multiple shows to it. And the tiers of how they built it out is just per downloads. And so if you're not hitting the download cap that they've set, which most people won't, I'm not anywhere near that, the lowest tier, then you can just keep adding shows. And so that's great. You had mentioned just a second ago that you were thinking about maybe starting a third podcast. It sounds like you've already given it some thought. What are you thinking with a third podcast?
So I've teased it out a couple times. My wife and I thought about doing one together a couple summers ago, just sort of like a short run kind of limited series. We may get to that, just some conversations about life and marriage and things like that don't necessarily fit the collective's conversation. So maybe some of that like almost Netflix model of like limited series kind of type shows where, hey, we're going to do 6 episodes on this conversation and not really try to build a brand out of it, but more just make it a resource and a tool for people like on very specific things. Again, that's why I like Captivate is like I can do as much of that as I want. Like if I want to create a series under a different title, I can do that there. So it's one of the benefits of it.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Well, I was looking back at your podcast in the beginning. You had started doing these episodes that were short 3-ish minute episodes that were giving your thoughts on the interview that published the previous day. And they were titled like Things I Learned From and then the guest's name. You had started doing those. And then I noticed that kind of after February, you'd stopped doing those. I'd love to hear what was the hope there and then what led you to stopping them.
Really to drive more downloads, like if I'm being honest, like that was part of it. Or for someone to hear the 3 minutes and go back and listen to the episode.
Sure, yeah.
Again, the other part of what I love to do is write. So I love to write and communicate. So that was a piece of it. It was a piece of me being able to go like, hey, I can take a quote from a guest, write some commentary about it, and record it and put it out. And I loved it. It was fun. It was good. It was taking a lot of time though. Really, I think, and maybe now that some things have shifted, I can get back to that and add that back to the podcast. And if you listen to it, like I would love people's feedback. I didn't get a lot of feedback early on because I didn't keep up with it long enough to see if people were engaging with it and really enjoyed that or not, or if they're just like, hey, Jeff, I just want to listen to the conversation. For me, it was just an outlet to have my say in the communication.
Sure.
When you're the host, like you're sitting on that side, Tim, you're just asking questions. You're like going, hey. And again, if you have natural curiosity, it's easy to ask questions. And that's what I feel like when I record is like, I'm naturally curious about my guest. I want to know. But sometimes I have thoughts, and this is just my hot take. Like, I think I get overly annoyed with hosts who are always interjecting their thoughts too much and not letting the guest talk. I'm like, you had this really great guest on. You should let them speak more. Like, I think there's time and space as a host to kind of add to the conversation, but sometimes I think it gets carried away. So the things I learned was really just that. It was like, hey, here's something I found really valuable from this guest. Let me expand on the idea from my thoughts. I may go back to it. I felt like it had some benefit and it was something I enjoyed doing. It just became a lot more time consuming than I wanted it to be to write that out.
I had a similar experience with my podcast at the beginning. I had an idea to do these how they could podcast episodes, and I would basically script out, similar to what you're talking about, just take the time, script something out. Ended up being shorter episodes, but like saying, basically doing some research. Hey, this organization should have a podcast, and this is what that could look like. It took way too long for me to put those together. My wife was like, Tim, you're spending so much more time on these episodes than you do preparing for an interview and having an interview. And the interviews sound more, come across more natural. I ended up asking some podcasting friends on their opinion. And they were like, yeah, I don't know if it quite fits. And so I thought it was a good idea. And I was hoping that would be a good idea, but ended up dropping it because, like you're saying, it just took up too much of my time to try and sustain that. And it made more sense to just have more guests on and talk to more ministry leaders about what they're doing, because that seemed to be more beneficial anyway to the audience.
Right. I think what you're saying is there's benefit to it, especially how they could. I mean, but again, it's if you and I were making a professional living at podcasting, then the time return is worth it, right? Like if we had a big sponsor who was like, yeah, add this 3-minute show, I'd be cool. I'll write and I'll do it. But like
sure,
when it's a hobby on the other side of what you're doing in real life, because you're passionate about it, it's hard to sometimes to the ROI on the time. But I'm an idea guy. So like the things I learned and the other things, like those are pinned up there going, maybe we'll come back to it when life kind of circles back to some more space.
Yeah. So what would you say you're most excited about now that you're several months into your podcast? What are you excited about for the future of your ministry and for the collective's conversations?
Yeah, I think sustainability. Like what I really want is just to keep going. I read a statistic, and I don't remember, it was a couple of years back, that most podcasts don't break the 8-episode mark. Like a lot of people start with high ambitions and it's fun and they have content early on or whatever. But just a sustainability to keep having more conversations. I'm hoping as we gain some traction that we'll get some guests and some different guests that want to be on the show. I will tease out that my DM conversation with Annie F. Downs did lead to booking her to be on the show, which is a big deal for me. I don't think I was asked to keep that a secret, but that will be in August that we'll record that. So yeah, I mean, just the hope that of continuance and sustainability.
Yeah.
As a communicator, I would love to see it open doors for me. And that's not never the intention of it, but maybe just the bonus of it that, hey, it opens doors for me to come speak or preach or whatever. But I just want to keep doing it because I really enjoy it. I've told the story a couple times, not on podcasts, but in other spaces. When I was 19 years old, I went to Illinois State University, and I was a broadcast journalism major, and I worked at our college radio station.
Nice.
I did news and sports reports for WZND, the Illinois State radio station. My sophomore year of college, I wrestled out this call to ministry and transferred from Illinois State to Lee University to finish my education. I never thought I would sit behind a microphone again, like not in this context, right? I thought radio days are gone. I'll never do that. And I remember the first time we recorded the podcast, Rob and I, we actually recorded in the studio at Lee University. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is like a full circle moment for me. Like the platform's different, but what God put in me at 19, he's bringing to pass in my 40s in a way I never thought it would come. So it's something that's always been kind of in me. And so I think that passion point, podcasting has allowed that to come to life in a way at 19 it didn't. And through an avenue, rather than reading news reports and kind of helping people with their faith journey in a way that God can use and be honored by. So I think it's just something I'm going to keep doing because it's part of me. It's built in me. It's in the wiring of how God made me. So I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. Yeah. That's cool to hear that story. Thanks for sharing that and hearing that it came full circle in that way and you're being able to use some of the skills that you used back then on this side of things. So I'd love to jump into the high pass segment now, which is where we ignore the lows and I ask you about some of your favorite things. So I've gathered that you're an avid coffee drinker, and so I'd love to know, what's your favorite cup of coffee?
I was a late bloomer on coffee. Like, I didn't start drinking till like my 30s. I drink it black for the most part, like just straight black coffee. I like a dark roast kind of. When I finally learned to drink coffee, which sounds crazy, Tim, that you have to learn to drink coffee, but got away from creamer and all those things, is you start to really taste the nuance of flavor of roasting, which was super cool for me. And so I like a good dark roast, just black, maybe some almond milk if I need to cool it off. Now, a summertime treat, I will say this. In the summertime, my wife and I will drive through Dunkin', and it's iced coffee with 2 pumps of vanilla and that sweet cream foam. And that's my sweet summer treat, man. That is out of this world good. So
nice. All right. I saw that you are also a dad of 5. And so I'd love to hear too, what's your favorite thing to do as a family?
It sounds crazy. Like, it sounds super simple, but dinner. Like, I'd love just now my oldest is grown and married, and we have a daughter at Belmont. Okay. So not everybody's home anymore. But when we're home, and who's home, we have 2 left in high school, to sit at the table, to eat together, and just kind of have these conversations and engage with them. I think what I'm learning now is those moments are very fleeting. They're actually, the 2 that are home are upstairs asleep because they're teenagers. They just finished their sophomore and junior year, so they're rising seniors and rising junior. Yeah. We're 2 years away from being empty nesters. I realize those moments are really fleeting to have those conversations. Yeah. So I love just that time around the table to talk with them and hear them. And I love that they feel like they can bring their friends or their boyfriend or girlfriend to have dinner with us. It's just a great place. Like, I think the family dinner table is so significant, and we need to slow down and not be in such a hurry.
All right. What's one of your favorite stories from a listener about how the Collectives Conversations podcast has impacted their life?
So there's a friend of mine. It was his Apple review, I guess, but he said it in person. He just appreciated the fact I was willing to kind of have hard conversations. It was based on the Natalie Runyon episode. Natalie is, if you know her on social media, she's raised to stay, and she's talked a lot about church hurt and staying in church. And it's just really, we kind of just got in the nitty gritty of it, which I enjoyed. But he was just very appreciative that in this platform, I was willing to kind of have the difficult conversations, which leads to other stories. Because when we had Beth Moore on, she was very critical of Christian nationalism, and we called heretics and all kinds of things. So with the good comes the bad, right? Yeah. I mean, like, there are those who are not going to like you and make it known. But for the most part, most of the commentary on both shows has been pretty good. And again, I love to hear that. If you're a fan or you listen to the Collectives Conversation, send a DM, leave a review, because one, I want to know how it impacts you. I don't think listeners know the value, not just for the algorithm. It helps the algorithm, sure. But the value to you and I when they're like, hey, this really helped me. Then now we know what's working, what's not working, how to steer conversations. We know that what we're doing has importance in the kingdom of God. And so, share the stories. Like, if you're a listener of Tim's, man, like, leave him a review and tell him what he's doing that you love, because it helps us on this side, encourages us to keep doing what we're doing. So,
yeah. Right back at you. If you're listening to Jeff's podcast, or if you jump over there after you listen to this episode, leave him some feedback too. Leave him a comment, because I mean, like he's saying, people do not leave a whole lot of feedback on podcasts, or as much as you'd like. There's usually a few here and there, but it's great to hear from people that you're actually making a difference. And basically the work that you're doing and the podcast episodes that you're putting out is actually getting to listeners' ears, and it's making a difference.
Well, I think the challenge, Tim, with that, and maybe because you're a producer, you could help us understand it better, is people listen on a mobile device or on their car. And so there's nothing like, I can't just tap there always to leave a review. Like, if I'm in my car listening and driving, you're like, and at the end of your show, and you probably say like I do, hey, leave a rating and review. But like, they're on the go, man. They don't have time for that. And so we maybe need to find a better way to get it to them to be like, hey, leave a review. It means the world. Or send a DM, whatever it is. Like, even if you have an email list, people don't reply to those most of the time. Like, so I don't know. Maybe we can find a better way to create a conversation about it.
Yeah, and Spotify has stepped into that with you can create polls and Q&As in it. And so I think how it functions is it's basically right down below the show notes. Like if you scroll down or page over, I can't remember what it is in the app, but you can then type something. So they're trying to make it a quicker experience in there. But yeah, still, if people don't know what's there or don't realize that, it was a great episode, but on to the next thing. So some way in which to get people to interact. But yeah, it's a constant thing to try and get some feedback, as well as, that's frequently what social media then is used for, is to get people engaged to some extent, and might hear, have some more engagement on that end of things with some of the shorter content from an episode or whatnot. But all right, last question before we close the episode. What's your favorite ministry podcast to listen to? Or what's your favorite ministry that you wish had a podcast, Jeff?
So I'll give you a list of ones I listen to semi-regularly. Yeah. We already mentioned Annie F. Downs. That's not really ministry, but she has great conversations.
Yeah.
I feel like Carrie Newhoff does a great job in the leadership space. I think Chad Veach's Leadership Lean In is another one that's really practical for ministers. A ministry I wish I had a podcast. I don't know. That's a great question, though. I've not really considered it. And they probably do. If they don't, then we should probably really get on them to do it. You know who I wish had a great podcast? This is, and they maybe do it. I need to look into it. Convoy of Hope. Are you familiar with Convoy?
Yeah, I've heard of Convoy of Hope.
Convoy is a disaster relief organization. They're out of the Assemblies of God, and they show up first at all these major disasters.
Yeah.
And so I think I would be way down if they did like a stories from the disaster kind of thing. Like, what did God do when we showed up to the hurricane relief thing? Or what did God do in Thailand when there was a typhoon or whatever? And like just telling stories, I would be like way into that, I think. So Convoy, get on it. Let's do it.
That's a great idea. Great idea. All right. Well, Jeff, as we close today's episode, what would you say is your best advice for other pastors or ministry leaders who are getting started in podcasts this year?
Just do it. Like, just keep doing it. Like, it is a marathon, not a sprint. I wish somebody would have said that to me when I started in 2019. Like, you think you're going to have millions of listeners on episode 3 when you have like your mom and somebody else's mom listening. That's about it. But it's worth the work. So again, you're always have to refine it and keep improving. But if you're a church, if you're a ministry leader, and you feel like God's giving you a message of some sort, it's worth the work. I mean, if nothing more, I heard Kevin B. Jennings say this, and he's a marketing guy, and he said the church is really good at making content that we never use again. So for years, pastor would preach a message, it never got recorded, and that he never preaches it again. If nothing more, like, record your messages, like, so you can go back and listen to them, or you can share them with somebody. Yeah, like it's the old tape ministry. I'm showing my age now, but somebody would record it. They would put it on tape, and they would spend hours duplicating tapes. It is like 100 times faster than duplicating tapes, right? You know. But it's a great resource to make your content evergreen, to make it where you can come back to it. And maybe you've talked about this on your show, but like even now to the point where you can take your podcast platform and you can send it to YouTube as a podcast. Everything is so simple right now that there's no reason not to do it. Like for $100 or less, you can be in the business, man. Yeah, for sure. For sure. So that's great encouragement, great advice. Jeff, thank you so much for being on the podcast today, taking your time to share your podcasting journey with my listeners here on Ministries That Podcast. Awesome, Tim. Thank you so much for having me. It means a lot. It was a lot of fun to talk with Jeff about all sorts of topics, from his podcast being near the top of the Annie F. Downs Spotify playlist, to starting his own podcast after co-hosting the Leadership Drip for a few years, to changes he's made to his own podcast since launching it at the beginning of the year. And then his advice there at the end echoes what we've heard from so many other ministry leaders on the podcast. If you're thinking about getting started in podcasting this year, just do it. And remember, it's a marathon, not a sprint, but it's worth the work. You can listen to the Collective's conversations with the link in the show notes. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Ministries That Podcast, produced by Sondomorphic. If you enjoyed today's episode, follow or subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend. That's the best way to get the word out so we can help more ministries grow and thrive through podcasting. Now come back in 2 weeks to hear my conversation with Patrick Miller. He's a pastor and director of digital relationships at The Crossing, along with being a co-host of 10-Minute Bible Talks, devotional Bible study.
Patrick and I are going to talk about the challenges they had to overcome as they started their podcast, why they have 5 co-hosts on their show, and the decision to have an email newsletter in addition to the podcast. Well, until next time, keep encouraging your audience as they follow Jesus.